All right, guys, and welcome back. Now we're going to be starting Chapter 3. So Chapter 3 is called the Real Estate License Law and Commission Rules. Now, Chapter 3 is a little bit of a continuation of Chapter 2. It just kind of dives deeper into kind of the licensing process, but more of the organizations and kind of like some of the specific rules that apply for licensing. Okay, so before we dive into those particular rules, let's start to understand the organizations that govern our real estate industry. First things first, we have the DBPR, or the Department of Business and Professional Regulations. That is the place where you're going to submit your application to whenever you're going to get your license. So the DBPR is the organization or the governing body of licensing throughout the state of Florida. So the state pretty much uses this department to issue all the different licenses that different industries require. For example, if let's say you're a restaurant and you need a licensing for liquor or restaurant stuff, you go there. If let's say you're and don't quote me on that. If you don't, it might be a little different. But if let's say you're also a cosmetologist, or let's say you're a barber, or let's say you're in, different industry, the majority of the licensing for the state of Florida has to go through the Department of Business and Professional Regulations. Okay, so again, that's the governing body of licensing, and they deny, they accept, and they control the licensing part of the real estate industry. Okay, then we have what we call the Division of Real Estate, or the DRE. Now, you would think the Division of Real Estate would be the big body that governs real estate, but in reality, they don't. The Division of Real Estate is like a minor division that helps the governing body, which we'll cover next, with just aiding them with supplies, with clerical work, with the things that FREC requires. Okay? So again, the Division of Real Estate is like a second division that aids the main division or governing body, which we're going to cover now. And the governing body, or what we call, or the way I kind of describe it, is this is the government of the real estate industry, just like the United States government is to the United States. Okay, so this is going to be the Florida Real Estate Commission, or what we more commonly know as FREC. Okay, so now the commission, FREC, or the Florida Real Estate Commission, is the organizing body or the governing body of the real estate industry. They're essentially the ones responsible for making sure that we comply with the rules and regulation. If we have an infraction or commit a violation, they're the ones that punish us, and they're the ones that can potentially take our license away, suspend us, put us on probation, depending on what it is that we do or may not do. Okay, but ultimately, the way it works is, again, DBPR issues licenses. FREC, or the Florida Real Estate Commission, governs the real estate industry, and then you have the Division of Real Estate, which helps the FREC, or helps FREC with the operations of real estate. All right? But also, guys, make sure you know all the variations of FREC, because they can use them interchangeably in the exam. One question, they can say, the Florida Real Estate Commission, blah, 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 blah. The next question, they could say, FREC, blah, 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 blah. And then the third question, they could say, the commission, blah, 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 blah. And they expect you to know that all three terms are the exact same thing. So make sure you know the variations, because that's important to, be able to answer the question correctly. Okay? So again, now we're going to look at the composition and the qualifications for FREC. Okay, or the commission, or the real estate commission. So essentially, FREC headquarters are in Orlando. Okay, so the way whenever FREC members go into meetings, they have to travel to Orlando because their headquarters are there. Okay, but we also need to know the composition. So FREC is the easiest way to do it is to use your hands. Now, as we go through the course, there's going to be I'm going to be passing on my tricks, my processes, the things that I created for myself whenever I was studying to make sure that I could pass these exams. So a lot of these tricks that I'm going to teach you you're not going to be able to find them out there because I made them up for myself. And, the processes do work, because hence why we have so many students that have passed the course and have loved the material, because of the processes that we put in place. So one of the things that I like using is visuals. So usually my hands give me a great deal of help, because now I don't have to memorize extra things if my hands can serve as aid. So for example, looking at the composition of FREC. FREC has 7 members, okay? And I always use my hands, because one of the questions on your exam is going to be how many members and who are those members for FREC, okay? Well, FREC has 7 members. It's got 4 brokers, 1 sales associate or broker, and 2 unlicensed individuals is what composes FREC at any given point. Because again, there's got to be 7 members. But you got to know that distribution. And again, you could remember, most likely, if you want to memorize, 2 unlicensed, 4 brokers, 1. But ultimately, why do that if your hands could tell you that breakdown? Because if you put them out like this, and you always go 4, 1, 2, it'll drag in your brain 4, 1, 2, and it's just going to break it down, so it's easier for you to remember it. Because again, you always want 4 brokers, because again, the brokers are the higher experienced individuals. Then you have 1 sales associate or broker. It could be either or. And then you're going to have 2 unlicensed people, and that is the 7-member composition of FREC. Now, the other rule is that 1 out of the 7 must be 60 years or older. Okay, 1 out of the 7. Now I ask you guys, and let's think about this logically. Why do you think FREC includes 2 people that are not licensed, and 1 person out of the 7 has to be 60 years or older? So take a second, think about that. Why would they want to include people that aren't in real estate or have a license to be in real estate within the governing body of the real estate industry? Think about that for a second. Okay, what would be logical? Well, the fact of the matter is that whenever decisions are being made, if everybody that was making a decision was part of the real estate industry, without meaning, we're always going to be a little bit more biased to ourselves and what we already do. But an unlicensed individual, when it's time to make decisions, is going to give input from the consumer side because they don't have a license. So that way, the goal is to create fairness, or to essentially have input from all angles, people that are licensed, people that are unlicensed, so that way a fair decision can be made. That is why we have 2 unlicensed individuals that are part of FREC, so that way we have a balanced decision-making process, and one of those people has to be 60 years or older, because they also want that disparity of age, so then inputs from people that have been in the industry for a really long time or have more of a view, older view, versus a more modern view of or point or perspective of life as it is. And essentially, again, it's just trying to make the decision as balanced and as unbiased as possible by having young and old, as well as licensed and unlicensed. And that's try to keep the fairness in FREC and decision-making process, okay? But that will be a question on your exam. Again, 4, 1, 2. 4 brokers, 1 sales associate or broker, and 2 unlicensed individual, where 1 of the 7 must be 60 years or older, okay? Now, FREC members are appointed by the governor and are subject to for confirmation by the Florida Senate. So again, appointed by the governor, confirmed by Senate. Okay? Now, when it comes to the compensation of FREC members, FREC don't really make that much money. They only really make $50 a day. That's all they make whenever they're doing official business for FREC. But what they do get is all their expenses paid. They get travel expenses, they get food expenses, they get hotel expenses covered. Essentially, all out of pockets. Mileage, meals, hotels, everything is covered. But they only make $50 a day. So that's kind of like the downside. So just make sure you know that. Also, whenever they meet, there's got to be quorum. Make sure you know that term, because that's probably what they'll use on the exam. And all quorum means, it means majority. So out of the 7 members, 4 have to be present to conduct official business, or what they refer to, there's got to be quorum to conduct official business, or majority. Okay? Keep that in mind. Now, we're going to be looking at the Commission general powers and duties. Like, what are the responsibilities, what are the powers, what are the duties of FREC? Well, this is where I tell you that the governing body of real estate is the governing body of the United States, the country in itself, because the powers are pretty much like our government powers. So let me ask you guys this. What are the branches of our government? Like, whenever we think about our government, what are the branches that essentially govern our country? It's going to be executive, legislative, and judicial. Same exact thing applies, but on a small scale for the real estate industry. So again, FREC is the equivalent of our government, but for the real estate industry. The reason being is, their first duty is going to be the executive power, meaning foster the education and applicants and licensing, adopt a CO, establish fees. So executive, meaning that they're enforcing the laws and the things that have been created. Okay? Then the second power is going to be called quasi-legislative. Remember, we have a legislative branch, and we also have a quasi-legislative process or branch, if you will, in FREC or real estate as well. The difference is, though, is that in real estate it's called quasi-legislative because they can only create laws for the industry. They cannot create laws for the state of Florida. So they don't have full legislative power. They have quasi-legislative power to the specific industry. Okay? And then lastly, we have quasi-judicial. Okay? So quasi-judicial would be the equivalent of our judicial, branch. The difference, the reason it's quasi is because by law, FREC cannot incarcerate anybody. So that's why they're quasi. They can suspend us, they can revoke our license and kick us out of the industry, but they cannot put us in jail. They will alert the authorities if you commit a violation big enough that now is a potential criminal case. So yes, you could get locked up and go to jail, but that will be by the authorities or the police, not FREC. You potentially could lose your license too with FREC, but that criminal part will be dealt with the authorities, and the administrative or license part will be dealt directly with FREC. That's why they're quasi-judicial. So just to recap, again, you have executive power, which enforces the rules, legislative power, which creates the rules, and then judicial power, which punishes if you break those rules. Very similar to kind of like our government. Obviously, there's differences and little things, but in its basic form, that would be the easiest way, most simplest way for you to kind of compare them so you don't have to memorize it all. Okay? Now, the next thing we're going to cover is going to be the licensing expirations and the statuses. Okay? So it's going to be super important, guys, because this is also going to be tested. Now, I'm going to bring the board over real quick because this is a little bit, this topic, although is kind of simple to understand once you get it, could be a little bit tricky at first, okay? Now, when we started in the last chapter, we talked about how to get a license, the process, all these things, and I also told you licenses must be renewed every 2 years. The thing is, the real estate industry doesn't work on exactly every 2 years. Meaning, if you get your license today, you're not going to renew today 2 years from now. Doesn't work like a driver's license that it goes on your birthday and everybody's different. The way real estate industry works, there are 2 expiration dates throughout the year for all agents. No matter what. All of us expire either March 31st or September 30th. That is the only 2 days that all licenses expire. So you may ask yourself, okay, but you just told me that I can take the exam anytime. Well, yeah, you can take it anytime. The rule is, though, you cannot exceed 24 months. You can be, so your first renewal will always be between 18 months and 24 months. Because again, they're exactly 6 months apart. So we have March 1st or March 31st, and we have September 30th, which would be the equivalent of, this is going to be the last day of quarter 1 of the year and the last day of quarter 3 of the year. And all licenses expire. Now, depending on the day that you get the license, you're going to fall on one of these 2 dates. Whichever one is the closest to today without exceeding 24 months. Again, cannot exceed 2 years. Make sure you keep that in mind because they're going to try to trick you on this stuff. They're going to say, let's just say, they're going to say, Ricky got his license on, let's say, February 5th, 2024. That is when the person got the license. Now, they're going to ask you on the exam, when does his license expire? And the options they're going to give you are going to be, let's say, September 30th, 2026, September 30th, 2025, C, March 31st, 2026, and D, let's say March 31st, 2025. So that's how the answer choices are going to appear on the exam. Now, the most logical thing would be to say, oh, February 5th was the closest day. Oh, yeah, so it's going to be March 31st. Okay, actually, hold on. It's going to be March 31st. But the problem is, if you do, March 5th or March 31st of 2026 would be 2 years. Because you do, the closest one is March 31st, and 2 years from 2024 is 2026. Oh, there's the answer. I'm going to pick this one. That is the common mistake everybody makes. Because technically, if you went on February 5th, 2025, February 5th, 2026, if you go further, anything past February 5th, 2026, you just exceeded the 24 months. So that's not legal. That's not going to happen. So technically, your expiration date is going to be September 30th of the previous year. So if you think, September 30th and put 2026, here's the answer. And you're going to get that wrong. Because again, they're trying to trick you. So what did I do to make sure that I never get confused or I can never, ever, ever get this question wrong regardless what they throw at me? All I do is essentially create like a little line here, because if let's look at it as a clock, okay, where I go counterclockwise. If it makes sense to you clockwise, however your process works that you can understand it, by all means. But what I do is I put January 1st right here, and I put December 31st right here, and then down here I put July 1st, which is exactly, let's say, half the year. Okay? Now, if we look at it, beginning of the year, end of quarter 1, quarter 2, end of quarter 3, and quarter 4. Okay? So now, what I normally do is I plot whatever point they tell me. So let's say, from here to here, February 5th should be, let's say, somewhere here. February 5th, 2024. I clock it right there. Okay? So now, in order to ensure that I never exceed the 24 months and I don't get confused by the year, because again, we always want to kind of keep that in mind because that's where they're going to trick you is on the year, then we need to make sure that we do this process. So February 5th, 2024 is when I got my license. So what I do is I plot it like I showed you, then I take my pen and I go, February 5th, 2024, I got the license. February 5th, 2025, 1 year, so 12 months. Now, February 5th, 2026 would be exactly 2 years, but since technically you have to fall on one of these 2 days, we have to revert back to the previous expiration date. So essentially, I have to go back a year and my license would be September 30th, 2025. So the answer is actually B. Why? Because if I go to March 31st, I've exceeded 24 months. But then if I go back and put September 30th, 2026, technically I've gone an extra almost 8 months. Okay, so you always got to revert. So the whole point of this piece right here is that when I do my 24 months and I go back to the date, this will always remember or make me remember, hey, don't forget to go to the year before. Because the only other expiration date is this one, but it has to be the year before. So if you put A, or you thought it was A, you instantly went almost 30-something months past the expiration date. So keep that in mind, guys. 24 months is the max. So the minute you do this, so let's say you got the license, let's do one quick more example. Let's say you got the license on July 21st, 2025. Well, that's a lot easier because all you have to do is July 21st, 2025, July 21st, 2026, July 21st, 2027, and then I revert back to the previous day. So my answer is going to be March 31st, 2027. Simple as that. July 21st, 2025 is when you got it. So July 21st, 2026 is 12 months. July 21st, 2027 is 24 months. And then I go back to whatever the date is the closest day. So that's going to be March 31st, 2027. Okay, so just make sure you know that, guys. And again, if you have to review or rewind to make sure that you get this logic down, please do so because this will be a question in your exam. And this is a very, very easy question as long as you don't get confused by the date and you revert to whatever the correct date is. But the key is you cannot exceed 24 months and just revert to the closest date, expiration date before that day, and just watch out for the changing of years. Okay? So again, if you need to rewind, go ahead and do so you get it. All right, guys? But it's very, very important. Right? So that is going to be essentially the 2 expiration dates and the question you're going to get in your state exam. Now, the next part we're going to cover is the statuses of your license, because we can technically have 2 status. We can have an active status, which is exactly what you would think it would be. We're active, we can work, and we can transact as we normally would. The other status is going to be inactive status, okay? And under inactive status, we have 2 options, okay? We can either be voluntarily inactive or we can be involuntary inactive, okay? So first, voluntary. What do you think that would mean? Well, you're voluntarily telling the state, hey, I'm not going to transact or do real estate, but I don't want to give up my license. So I'm voluntarily putting my license as inactive because I know I'm not going to be working. So put it inactive. That way you're essentially shelving your license. Now the key to that is if you'd like to keep it because you may use it in the future, just keep renewing your license when you're supposed to. As long as you're voluntarily inactive and you do your renewals every single time that you're supposed to, just like if you were active, you can keep your license for however long you want and you'll never lose it because you keep renewing it and keeping it at least from expiring, but it is just you voluntarily shelved it. Okay? As a matter of fact, I have a buddy that is currently an agent, one of the top agents. He got his license back in 2007. Okay, but when he was 18. The difference is, back in those years, young people weren't really too common in the real estate industry as an agent. So when he first started, he wasn't getting too much luck because back then, people weren't so used to young crowds being top agents or being so part of the industry because back then, kids weren't getting the licenses like they're getting them now right out of high school. So the consumers weren't used to, again, seeing younger crowds handling their business or their properties. So then, rather than losing it, he put it inactive. And every 2 years, he kept renewing. Now, I didn't have my license then. My partner didn't have his license then. So we didn't, we just kept doing what we were doing. But once we got our license and the industry got better, he got older, he got more experience and felt like he wanted to come back, all he had to do is notify Freck, hey, I want my license active again. Didn't have to do nothing and reactivated it, 10 years later? But he kept renewing it. So he kept it in shelves, and whenever he decided he wanted it back, rather than start over and have to do the whole process again, all he did was tell Freck, hey, I'm ready to activate it. And the broker that he joined activated his license, and now he's a top producer and didn't have to do the process over. So keep that in mind, because as long as you do your 45 posts and keep renewing, you can keep that license shelved and do what you normally do, but don't have to restart and kind of, lose that license and get it all over again, okay? So that's going to be voluntary. Then the other one is involuntary inactive. That is when you don't do your continuing education and you lose, essentially, not lose, but you technically don't do your renewal process, okay? Now, keep in mind that I told you for the 45 posts, you lose the license. And now I'm telling you, if you don't do your education or renew it, you get to go involuntary inactive. So how does that work? Well, the post is your first renewal. Like I told you, after that first renewal, the state is way more flexible with agents because they did their first main portion, which was your first renewal with the post. When you're at the level of continuing education and you've already gone through that first renewal portion, the state sees you with more experience. So again, they're going to be a little more flexible. Now, in the chance that you don't do your 14-hour continuing, they're not going to just take your license and go null and void. Now the state says, well, since you already did your first renewal and your post, and you're in this portion and have more experience, but you didn't do your education and didn't renew, we're going to give you 2 more years to see if you want it. Okay, they're going to give you 1 more renewal cycle just to see if maybe you want to keep the license but haven't done it. So then ultimately, they're giving you the option to go involuntary inactive, because again, you didn't renew it, but you didn't lose it. So the way you get that license back whenever you're in an involuntary inactive, all you have to do is your 14-hour post that you were supposed to do, and you get it right back. And you go right back to active. Okay? But now, keep in mind, they're giving you 2 years. So on year 1 of inactivity, and that's involuntary inactivity, as long as you do your 14-hour, you'll go right back to active, transacting as you would. But if, let's say, that first year you don't do nothing, because you were like, nope, I don't really want the license, let it go. But for some reason, on that second year of inactivity, something sparks in you and you're like, oh my God, I actually do want my license, I want to lose it. Well, now you cannot do your 14-hour regular because you're on year 2 of inactivity. So what the state says is, okay, well, you were supposed to do 14 on year 1, but now we're on year 2, now we're going to double it. So now you're going to do double 14 hours. You're going to do the 28-hour reactivation course. And that is the last hurrah before you completely lose your license and have to start over. So make sure that if you go involuntary inactive, year 1, 14-year continuing, the one you were supposed to do, and then if you roll over to year 2, double it. They just call it the reactivation course of 28 hours. So after go ahead and you understand that level of the inactivity and activity, voluntary versus involuntary, that should be most likely one of the questions on your exam as well. So again, active, you can work and transact regularly. And just so you know, in case you ever had that question, the only way to activate your license once you get it is by the broker of the company you joined. So if, let's say, you get your license and never join a brokerage, you will never be active. You cannot work in the real estate industry unless you work under a broker. Okay, that's by law. So the broker is the only one that can activate your license. Then you have voluntary inactive. That is when you voluntarily shelf your license. As long as you keep renewing it when you're supposed to, it'll stay voluntary and active. And then involuntary is when you don't do your renewal and then your education. But again, you gotta know when, because they could test you. Oh, Ricky didn't do his renewal. What course should he have taken? And they could list all the courses. You gotta know it's not the post, because if you didn't do the post, what happens? You lose your license. So once you get past that first renewal and enter the continuing education portion of your renewal cycles, then and only then are you eligible for the inactivity under involuntary. Because if you do it in your first renewal, you just straight up lose your license. So keep that in mind and keep that straight, because that could get confusing, and that is where most likely they're going to test you. Okay? So definitely keep that in mind, guys. The next term is going to be null and void. Null and void is when your license ceases to exist. So if, let's say, you don't do your 45 post, or any post for that matter, the license is lost. Or if, let's say, you don't do your renewal once you're at the 14-hour continuing, and you go through 2 years of involuntary inactivity, the license will also go null and void. Okay? Next, we have a term called cease to be in force. Okay? This term is also, it's kind of a weird one. It's not going to be a traditional term that you ever deal with in the industry, because it's more of a transitional status for your license. So cease to be in force is a term strictly used when there's a transition, either from brokerage to brokerage, or the brokerage themselves transitions to a different location. So again, cease to be in force. They're not saying you can't work. Or I'm saying, they're not saying you lose your license. They're just saying you cannot transact temporarily because you're transitioning. Usually, it won't be the case, because you'll transition without, missing days if you schedule it accordingly. But if for whatever reason you leave a brokerage until you sign up for the other one, you're ceased to be in force and technically can't work because you're in transition from brokerage to brokerage. And the same applies when a brokerage or a school transitions from location to location. If the broker doesn't do it properly and time it accordingly, then their agents or whoever's in the brokerage is going to be ceased to be in force and technically can't work. But as long as the broker times it all correctly and does everything right, that shouldn't be a problem. Okay? Next, change of address and rules and penalties. So now, the state requires that any time you change your permanent address or wherever you live, they must know the correct address that you're at, or have a permanent address. The reason being is sometimes there's sensitive information that you need to make sure you do, and they gotta make sure that they know where you live. So the rule is, anytime you move, you're given 10 days to go ahead and notify FRIC of your address change. Because if you don't notify them and they catch you, now that could be an up to $1,000 penalty for not notifying when you change the address within those 10 days. Okay? So that's the rule. 10 days if you change addresses, or if you move out of the state, it's going to be 60 days to notify FREC you moved out, but 10 days within the state. Okay? Next, we have rules pertaining to non-resident licensees, which I just told you. That's going to be 60 days to notify FREC you left the state and moved out. All right? And the last two terms we're going to cover in this chapter, which again will pop up on your exam, is going to be multiple licenses and group licenses. Okay? And these are two terms that I need you to also batch in your head, because they kind of go together. And if you learn one, you should know the other by implication. Okay? So now look at it this way. Multiple licenses versus group licenses. Okay? Now, what did I tell you earlier for the sake of compensation? Okay? All sales associates or people that work for a brokerage have to get paid through the broker. A customer cannot come and pay you directly. They have to pay the brokerage or the broker, and then they pay you. Okay? So what that means is, if the broker is the one that pays and the ones that has to receive the compensation and runs the business, they essentially, if they want to run multiple businesses, then they need multiple licenses. So for example, if let's say which we have a referral company also, let's just look at it that way. So we have the brokerage, and let's say we have a referral company. That agents can also participate in things like that. Now, don't get so hung up on the referral company. Let's get hung up more so on the logic of this. So let's say a broker has a regular brokerage and they have a referral network for agents outside the state or agents that don't want to transact on a day-to-day basis. Now, the broker is going to require a license for the brokerage, and they're going to require a license for the referral company because technically that's a separate entity. Okay? Now, a sales associate cannot get multiple licenses because they work under a broker. Okay? So what that means is that the sales associate would have to get a group license if they want to work for the different entities the broker owns or controls or is the broker for. Okay? So let's put an example. Let's say Broker Joe has a brokerage, but wants the option of having a referral network. Okay? Let's just imagine that the referral network is a separate company that legally brokers can transact with. Okay? Now, if Joe wants to be the broker for both, Joe needs the multiple licenses because he's a broker. But now me, being a sales associate that works for Joe wants me to now help him with the referral company. Well, my license is to the brokerage, not the referral company. And since I'm not a broker, I cannot just get multiple licenses, but I work for Joe. So the state says, okay, since you're a sales associate, we're going to group it so you get one license, but you can work from all the businesses Joe owns and is a broker for. But Joe, being the one that runs the businesses, he actually needs the licenses to be able to run it. So to simplify it for you, multiple licenses are for brokers only. Group licenses are for sales associates that work under those brokers and those entities. So make sure just to keep it simple. Multiple license, brokers. Group licenses to work under the broker for sales associates. And that is going to be the simplest way for you to be able to kind of differentiate the two. Meaning, again, multiple licenses are for brokers because they're the ones that can get multiple licenses. And group licenses are for sales associates because you can't get multiple licenses if you're a sales associate. You group them together to work under that broker. Okay? So if let's say that concept's a little difficult to understand, just go ahead and rewind, re-listen, and try to grasp the topic. That in multiple licenses are for brokers and group licenses are for sales associates. As long as you kind of know that gist, you should be able to answer the question and at least be able to get that question right. All right, guys? Oh, and just so you know, Chapter 3 will have 2 questions that are going to go towards the state exam. Sometimes I feel like it's a little bit more because there's a good amount of info that I've seen on my exam, but that's what they tell us. So kind of keep that in mind. And that should and will cover Chapter 3. The important parts, again, are the licensing expiration dates, the statuses of the license, knowing the composition of FREC, the 7 members, knowing essentially the powers of FREC, legislative, executive, quasi-judicial, and making sure that you know the multiple licenses and group licenses. I would say those are probably about the more important parts, as well as the address change stuff. Okay, guys? So that's going to conclude for Chapter 3. 2 questions in the state exam, and I will see you for the next chapter. All right? See you then.